Thank you very much, Ben, for your introduction. And this is a sensitive topic, and I thought, well, this would be the opportunity to bring it up. You've all heard the expression unintended consequences. And I think what we have is a consequence from Erasmus's work that he didn't intend and probably did not anticipate. And ultimately, it has to do with the idea of his text becoming known, or variations of it, becoming known as the Textus Receptus. So that's why I have entitled my paper, Erasmus and the Beginnings of Textual Fundamentalism. And just to let you know where I'm going, I have very much in mind the well-known former Christian, former fundamentalist, Bart Ehrman, for example, and perhaps others not as well-known as he, but who nonetheless have followed the same path. So please understand that there is a pastoral perspective and motivation behind this paper. And I'm not trying to offend anyone. I'm not trying to trouble anyone. In fact, it's just the opposite of that, as you will see. For several years, Desiderius Erasmus worked on a critical edition of the Latin text. By collating and sifting dozens of Latin manuscripts, Erasmus produced a text he believed was superior to that produced by Jerome more than 11 centuries earlier. In 1516, Erasmus published his new Latin text along with a Greek text based on a collation of 7 manuscripts. And I might mention them. The oldest manuscript is Minuscule II. That's how we identify it now, and it is at the University of Basel in its library, and it might date to the 11th century. We're not sure. It could be early 12th or perhaps late 11th. Now that's the oldest manuscript of these 7 manuscripts that Erasmus collated in producing the Greek text. The other manuscripts are either 12th century and 2 of them are 15th century. And of course, one of our speakers at this conference will be Dan Wallace, and he can tell you about all the manuscripts we have since that time, in the last 500 years, discovered, cataloged, looked at, compared, and the record has changed enormously. If Erasmus were with us today, he'd be like the proverbial, child in a toy store or candy shop, just going crazy with the riches that we now possess, and how far back many of these manuscripts now reach in time. In fact, of the 7 manuscripts that he had, he did not have a complete text of the book of Revelation. So that's where it all started. The Latin and Greek appear in columns side by side. The work was published in Basel by Johann Froben under the curious title Novum Instrumentum Omne, the whole new instrument. Now, he had referred in publishing and writings elsewhere as Scripture as an instrument. So in that sense, it isn't that strange, but it is nevertheless a curious title. The first edition was filled with errors, perhaps due to the haste of preparation, the 1516 edition. A second edition appeared in 1519 under the more familiar title Novum Testamentum Omne, the whole New Testament. In the second edition, most of the errors were corrected, though not all, and a number of other changes were made. The second edition was used by Martin Luther for his German translation of the New Testament. A third edition of Erasmus's work appeared in 1522, which was used by William Tyndale for his English translation, and by the translators of the Geneva Bible and the King James Version of 1611. The third edition of Novum Testamentum Omne is famous for its inclusion of the longer reading of 1 John 5, 7-8, the well-known Comma Johanneum. A fourth edition of Novum Testamentum Omne appeared in 1527, and the fifth and final edition appeared in 1535, not long before Erasmus's death. Initially, Erasmus seems to have been more interested in publishing a better Latin edition of the New Testament than in producing a critical edition of the Greek text. Professor George commented on this last night, and I do tilt in that direction. I'll have to now dip into a footnote to explain why. But it does seem to be the implication of a comment he makes in an oft-cited reference in his Epistle 305, where he says, in reference to the first edition, "There remains the New Testament translated by me." Well, that's the Latin he's referring to, with the Greek facing, and notes on it by me. So the focus in that comment does seem to be on the Latin translation, and almost as an aside, he notes that he has collated a Greek version to go right alongside this new and much better Latin rendering of Scripture, of the New Testament in any case. In another one of his letters, Epistle 337, he complains of ignorant scribes who mistranslate the Greek. And so again, the focus seems not so much on the Greek text as such, but on how it's rendered into Latin. But anyway, that's just an aside. By the time his fifth edition was published, the emphasis seems to have shifted to the Greek. At least that's how scholars throughout Europe responded to his new edition of Scripture. In any event, the Reformation, which was now well underway, created an environment in which scholars focused their attention on the original text, not its Latin translation. This meant interest in the Greek of the New Testament and, in due course, the Hebrew and Aramaic of the Old Testament. So let's consider the influence of the text of Erasmus. The Greek text of Erasmus was published by many others in the 16th and 17th centuries. A number of influential European translations of the New Testament were based on it as well. Robert Estienne, 1503 to 1559, also known as Stephanus, produced 4 editions of the Greek New Testament. Although he depended on the later editions produced by Erasmus, Stephanus took into account the readings of other manuscripts. Theodore Beza, 1519 to 1605, published 9 editions of the Greek New Testament. The Elsevier Publishing House in 1633 published a Greek New Testament largely based on the text of Beza, but Beza, of course, is largely based on Erasmus. In the preface to the second edition of the Elsevier edition, the editors declare the following, and if you'd like, I can give it to you in Latin, but here's what it is in English. "So you hold the text, now received by all, in which is nothing changed or corrupted." And the text received is Textus Receptus, and that's where we get the name Textus Receptus. So don't think that Erasmus called his either New Instrument or New Testament the Textus Receptus. That comes much later, more than a century later. And so the text on which the King James translators based their New Testament was this Textus Receptus. But I think it's very interesting what that whole sentence says, and I think it got the ball rolling in a certain way. It is this notion that we now have an established authoritative text that has encouraged the emergence of the phenomenon that I call textual fundamentalism. Note especially that the editors of the second Elsevier edition claim that there is nothing changed or corrupted. Nihil immutatum aut corruptum. We now have an inerrant text, an edition essentially understood as identical to the autographic text. Or at least this is the way some could understand what is meant by the words Textus Receptus. Erasmus's printed critical edition of the Greek New Testament represents a great step forward in the scholarly study of the New Testament. But it also laid a foundation on which an uncritical understanding of the biblical text could find apparent support. The idea of a text in which there was no corruption created the context, if not incentive, for the development of a new form of fundamentalism. Now, I realize in using that word this way here, it's very anachronistic because that's not how people were speaking 500 years ago. And so I am deliberately using a more modern term in the way it's used now to hark back to an interesting development in the text of the Greek New Testament. Because prior to the printing press and prior to Erasmus's text, every manuscript, as the word implies, was written by hand, and no two were the same. And so having differences in the text was, if you were a scholar and you were in the library and you were going through the books, you noticed that all the time, and it wasn't shocking or strange the way it is in the post-Gutenberg, post-Erasmus era, the era in which we live. The idea of a text in which there was no corruption created this new context. A fundamentalism emerged, again using the word, as I explained, in an anachronistic way, that focused on the ipsissima verba autographorum, that is, the very words of the autographs. And eventually, with respect to the teaching of Jesus, scholars could speak of the ipsissima verba Jesu, that is, the very words of Jesus. After all, if we are now in possession of the autographic text, that is, the actual Greek word for word written by the apostles, the authors of the New Testament, we are now in possession of the exact words spoken by Jesus. And this shifts the whole context and frame of mind and way of thinking. This is new, and it's with us to this day, and it's the foundation for a lot of the debate and what I consider some of the harmful fundamentalism that plagues the conservative church today. Prior to the existence of printed editions of the Greek New Testament, in which for the first time multiple copies with identical readings circulated, no two manuscripts were identical. This may come as a shock to some of you. This is not in this paper, but just as an aside, I've looked at the whole question of autographs, and we have autographs not of biblical literature, but of other writings from antiquity. And you can compare an autographic text and then a copy that is made to retain, and they're almost never are the same. So here's from the pen of the author or his scribe, and so a copy sent, a copy retained, and they are not identical. And so the idea of an original text is itself theoretically problematic. All of early Christianity's theologians and interpreters who had access to two or more New Testament manuscripts were aware of this, and certainly Erasmus. With the printing of identical text based on a critical comparison of several manuscripts, the expectation arose that an original could and should be recovered. Accordingly, some scholars in the Reformation period and beyond believed the Textus Receptus was such a text, or at least they claimed that. They declared that. It was this conviction that in time gave rise to aspects of the fundamentalism that arose in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. This fundamentalism was very much focused on the text of Scripture, especially the text of the Greek New Testament. Not surprisingly, many fundamentalists reacted very negatively to the Greek New Testament published by Westcott and Hort in 1881. The new text represented a departure from the Byzantine family of texts on which Erasmus and the Textus Receptus were based. The Textus Receptus, which is supposedly free from corruption and is supposedly unchanged. Alas, for the defenders of the Textus Receptus, the march toward establishing the Greek text based on the oldest manuscripts available was very much underway. There could be no turning back. Not only were more old codices being discovered in libraries and monasteries, new finds of papyri, mostly in Egypt, made it possible to recover fragments of text reaching back to the 3rd and even the 2nd centuries. I have no doubt that if Erasmus were here today, he would be astounded by these discoveries. With the new discoveries, however, it became evident that there were variants in the earliest copies of Scripture read and studied in the church. But of much greater significance was the realization that there really are discrepancies among the Gospels themselves. Getting back to a text that was much closer to the original revealed the presence of many harmonizations, scribal harmonizations, where scribes either consciously or unconsciously harmonized the wording of parallel passages. So Matthew, Mark, and Luke would read almost the same way. Discrepancies were hard to miss in the mass-produced printed texts of the Greek New Testament based on older, less harmonized manuscripts. So what I'm saying is, if you go back to before Erasmus's text and you have different Byzantine-era manuscripts, Matthew and Luke might read the same way in a parallel passage. Word for word, perhaps, when Jesus says something. But if you can go back in time, and thanks to these new discoveries we could, you would discover that Matthew and Luke did not, in fact, always read the same way, that how Jesus said it in Matthew wasn't quite the same way as he said it, quite the same as in Luke. And, of course, now you have printed, so you not only have printed Greek New Testaments, multiple printings where it's the same text and everybody can see it, but as they began to be, like in Westcott and Hort and beyond, based on older manuscripts, the discrepancies were now hard to miss. They were quite apparent. And this led then to, I think, shell shock for some fundamentalists who were still clinging to this notion of the Textus Receptus that was incorruptible and unchanged. How to understand these discrepancies was hotly debated. For many fundamentalists, these discrepancies were very problematic. Some tried to wish them away either through unconvincing harmonizations or verbal gymnastics. For some fundamentalists, the discrepancies of the Gospels led to a crisis of faith, for discrepancies were often seen as a euphemism for errors. And if errors, then Scripture could no longer be trusted. And so it is to this difficult issue I now turn. And so in this part of my paper, I'm calling the meaning of the differences and discrepancies in the Gospels. Any fair, careful reading of the Gospels side by side, the parallel columns, and I'm thinking especially of the synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, will reveal a number of differences and discrepancies. Bart Ehrman, if I may cite him, in his book, Jesus Interrupted, that appeared in 2009, on page 21 says, reading the Gospels horizontally, that is, putting them in the three parallel columns, and then reading the parallel passages horizontally, comparing each to the other, reveals all sorts of differences and discrepancies. So that's what leads him to launch into the thesis that these differences, these discrepancies, suggest mistakes and errors, and therefore the Gospels really cannot be trusted. They really are not reliable. Now, what I want you to understand is I disagree with that completely. So he's making an accurate and fair observation, but he's leaping to the wrong conclusion. I think he's still victimized by the fundamentalist paradigm that began to develop about 500 years ago, and then intensified in the 19th and 20th centuries. Some of these discrepancies are more apparent than real, but many of them are indeed real. We observe differences in the wording of Jesus' teaching. Sayings clustered together in one gospel, such as in Matthew, for example, a discourse in Matthew, are scattered over several chapters in another gospel, as we see, for example, in Luke, or in what's called his central section, chapters 10 to 18. The order and sequence of a number of episodes sometimes vary from one gospel to another. Details and parallel stories sometimes vary, and on it goes. Most scholars are not troubled by such discrepancies, recognizing a number of factors involved. In fact, many gospel commentators revel in the differences. for differences are often indicators of interpretive and theological nuances that provide clues as to the respective evangelist strategies and purposes for writing. Although the Matthean evangelist liked what he found in the Gospel of Mark and so incorporated about 90% of it, he did not hesitate to make revisions. By supplementing the Markan narrative with additional teaching, by adding a number of fulfillment quotations, and by doing some old-fashioned editing, Matthew tried to show how Jesus was not, in fact, a lawbreaker, but a fulfiller of the law, a figure greater than Moses, who teaches the true way of righteousness, a figure who is wiser than Solomon, and a figure who is a king greater than David. The evangelist Luke also appreciated the Gospel of Mark, but his purpose for writing was very different from Matthew's. Luke augmented, rearranged, and edited material inherited from Mark and elsewhere, all in an effort to show, among other things, that what God accomplished in Jesus was of profound significance for all people and not just for Israel. In presenting the teaching of Jesus in this new light, the evangelist Luke prepared for his second volume, the book of Acts, which recounts the birth of the church and its evangelistic outreach to Israel and the Roman Empire. But it wasn't only the evangelists who edited the teachings and stories of Jesus. So did Jesus' earliest followers, long before the Gospels were written. Gospel scholars are convinced that the tradition inherited by the evangelists had been edited to one degree or another. In other words, the earliest recitation of the words and deeds of Jesus was not static or frozen. It was a living, adaptable tradition. Scholars familiar with the pedagogy of late antiquity, pedagogy that is theories of instruction and practice of instruction, how you went to school and how you learned, scholars who are familiar with this pedagogy from late antiquity, in both Jewish as well as Greco-Roman circles, know this and are not troubled by it. The differences, the adaptations, the so-called discrepancies. But I suspect many conservative Christians, especially those of a fundamentalist stripe, may not know this and probably don't know this and may view the editing and adapting of Jesus' teaching with misgivings. You can conduct an experiment. Just say, look how Matthew edited what he inherited from Mark. See what the reaction is. Nobody edited anything. It's what I call the Book of Mormon mentality. It just sort of drops out of the sky. Nobody edited anything. That's the thinking, that's the assumption. And pastors and teachers in the church need to do a better job, because it's a shame if a bright student showing a lot of promise, interested in Christian faith, takes the Scriptures seriously, then gets blown out of the water by an observation of how things actually are. How did we leave them so unprepared, is what I would like to know. Discrepancies are also due to the approach taken in writing history. The ancients debated among themselves what constituted proper history. Don't assume that the way we understand history, historiography, how history ought to be researched and written, don't assume that that was the thinking in antiquity. Writing of history was a relatively new thing in the first millennium BC. People were trying to figure out, well, how do you do that? What is the right thing to do? Some believed it was best to produce annales, or yearly records, annuals, yearly records of events. Others believed it was better to write capitulatum, that is, to write summarily, that is, history arranged by subject matter or topics. Still others thought it appropriate to describe res gestae, things done, which often focused on the magni viri antiqui, that is, the great men of the past. Many thought one's history should offer an apologia or defense of a person or a people. Some of these approaches attempted to maintain chronological order, as in the annales, but others did not. All are selective and all have specific purposes and agenda. The kind of history and biography that the Gospels offer should be understood in this wider context, exhibiting some of these styles, and not as modern history or biography. The discrepancies of the Gospels began with Jesus himself. His teaching was not static and unchanging. It was adaptable. It was situational. It was applied to a variety of settings, and it was altered as the occasion required. He taught his disciples accordingly. Yes, they were to learn his teaching, to memorize his words, but they were expected to apply them according to the needs of evangelism and teaching. These disciples are learners, mathitai, and that's what the word disciple means. And the singular mathites is one who learns, from the verb manthanein, to learn. It's the same in Hebrew. Lamad is to learn, and then the cognate word, learner, is talmid. So you learn the material, but it isn't just to memorize it. And I think that's where the mistake begins, and that's where the problem begins. Jewish, you might say, well, okay, that's good for the Greeks and the Romans, but what really has this to do with the Jewish people? Isn't there a big divide, a big gap between Jewish scholarship, Jewish approach to Scripture, pedagogy, even historiography, and of course Greco-Roman? Well, actually, there wasn't much of a gap, not since Alexander the Great in the 4th century, who swept through Israel and made it very much part of the Greco and then later Roman worlds. Jewish and Greco-Roman pedagogies, or styles of teaching, were not separate and isolated from one another. Most of the rabbinic rules, this might surprise some of you, but the rabbis who had their 7 rules, and then this later was expanded to many more, their rules of exegesis, these rabbinic rules come right out of Greek scholarship. Greek and Jewish memory techniques and book habits, the book culture, you might say, techniques and practice overlapped. Techniques of argumentation overlapped. Scribal practices overlapped. Indeed, the Greek gymnasium or university was present on Jewish soil, even in the vicinity of Jerusalem itself, as early as the 2nd century BC. There are a number of studies. There was a classic study that appeared 50 years ago, a Jewish scholar, Saul Lieberman, Hellenism and Jewish Palestine, studies in the literary transmission, beliefs, and manners of Palestine in the 1st century BC to the 4th century AD. And he makes that case that Jewish scholarship, rabbinic scholarship, was heavily indebted to Hellenism or Greek scholarship. You might say, well, that book's very old, but actually it's been treated more recently by Martin Jaffe, Torah in the Mouth, Writing and Oral Tradition in Palestinian Judaism, 200 BC to 400 AD, and he arrives at the same conclusion as Saul Lieberman had. So what we have then, it may be a very biblically informed faith. There may be great concern to avoid the pollutions and the idolatries of the Greeks and then later the Romans. And so the faithful, the Jewish faithful, may have been very Torah observant and very concerned with kosher food laws and purity laws and so forth, but they studied their sacred texts in ways very similar to the way the Greeks studied their sacred texts, like Homer. And their pedagogy was very similar. And their theories of hermeneutics and exegesis, very similar. And so we have much to learn then from this Greco-Roman pedagogy, and then closely connected to it, historiography, how you write history, by looking at that. And I think it will help us understand how to deal with the discrepancies, the differences that involve the Gospels, and you could apply this to other literature, of course, when you compare Samuel and Kings with Chronicles and so forth. So let me repeat, the discrepancies in the Gospels begin with Jesus himself. The way he taught, the way he personally taught, but also the way he mentored his own disciples, teaching them how to teach. And then we see that right up in the way that Jesus' tradition is preserved, adapted, expanded, contracted, applied, and how the Gospels themselves, it carries right on into the Gospels themselves. And you can see then what Matthew and Luke do with earlier material. Obviously, I'm a mark and priority person. So how do we know this? Because we actually have found the handbooks from antiquity. We're in a position where we can read how you're supposed to teach students, what students are supposed to learn, what they are to do with the teaching they receive from the masters. It's actually very illuminating. So how does it work? Young Greeks began their education by memorizing what they called kreia, brief anecdotes. A kreia is the singular, C-H-R-E-I-A, kreia, and then just add an I on the end of it, and iota, now it's plural. A kreia just simply means a useful story, a useful anecdote. It could be about something a great teacher did. It could be something that relates what he taught. He sees something and makes a comment. Somebody asks him a question. He replies. And it can be a combination. He's doing something and then he says something. That's what these kreia are. And so it's considered useful or valuable, and it's something that you want to learn. As the student progresses, he learns to insert a kreia into his argument. So he's making an argument, and then he can say, well, that is like the time when Plato, when asked by one of his students, such and such, said this. So the student begins to learn how to make his own argument, and you can see how this then would relate to rhetoric. He begins to make his argument by picking out proper anecdotes or kreia and inserting them into his argument. As the student progresses, he learns to insert a kreia into his argument and to string together several kreia. And in doing so, he's free to edit the beginnings and the endings of the kreia so he can introduce them so that they will fit in with whatever it is he's doing. His argument, the point he's trying to make, whatever. The student is not only permitted to edit these pithy anecdotes, he's required to do so for the sake of clarity. After all, when Plato said such and such, or Socrates said such and such, that was a long time ago in a different place, and so it's necessary in order to introduce it effectively so that the new generation of students can understand it, to modify it a bit and put it into the train of thought in a way that's coherent and makes good sense. This point needs to be underscored. Recitation of these anecdotes presupposed memorization, but memorization did not prohibit a change in the wording, nor did it prohibit expansion or contraction. So long as the change remained true to the original meaning and intent. The overarching concern was clarity. New Testament scholars have discovered the kreia form in the Gospels. This has been much discussed in the literature of the last 35 years or so. And it disappoints me that I think this very significant line of research which I think could even be described as a breakthrough, just hasn't impacted conservative evangelical scholarship to the extent it really should. It's still undiscovered material, in my experience. As in the case of the Crea, so in the Gospels we observe relatively stabilized units of tradition, sometimes from Q, and I don't mean to get embroiled in a big Q controversy, but what is Q? Well, it's not what the Jesus Seminar has tried to make of it or what others do, but what it is simply that source of material that Matthew and Luke tap into. It's Jesus' teaching. It's the pre-Easter, pre-Passion Week teaching of Jesus that Matthew and Luke are aware of, and I think Mark also. And so Matthew and Luke tap into this, and that's how come they have expanded, lengthier Gospels compared to the shorter and earlier Mark. So they take Mark, and Mark provides a framework, a narrative framework, and they simply beef up the Markan material with additional teaching from Jesus, and that's what we mean by Q. I'm not sympathetic to notions that there were different Q editions or different corresponding Q communities that knew this or didn't know that, or and so on. I think that is just all speculation and has no foundation. So the Gospels, we observe in the Gospels relatively stabilized units of tradition, often from Q, rearranged, expanded, and introduced and contextualized in various ways. This is what creates the discrepancies and the differences. This editing, adapting, clustering, and contextualizing quite naturally and unavoidably created differences and discrepancies. This always happens when we have overlapping parallel accounts whose purposes and styles vary. The ancients knew this. So did early Christians who gathered the parallel yet discrepant Gospels side by side in 2nd and 3rd century codices. These people weren't stupid, they weren't blind, they could see that Matthew, Luke, and Mark covered the same ground oftentimes and did so with different wording. They could see that, and sometimes in a different order. That was not lost on them. And by the way, I have a footnote where I note that the pre-Gutenberg press medieval scholars knew it too. And some very fine, what we would call redaction criticism, the word that German scholarship, slightly different in the German, but German and Anglo scholarship invented in the 1950s, there were medieval interpreters practicing that long ago without any crisis of faith, observing how Matthew and Luke and Mark have edited the Jesus tradition in different ways. And they make very insightful, penetrating comments from an exegetical point of view that I think were right on the money. And that's like 700 years ago. So what's our problem anyway? That's why I'm not trying to blame Erasmus for anything. I'm just saying that was an unintended consequence, stabilizing the text in his time, thanks to the printing press and thanks to his own text critical work, where he compares and collates a number of manuscripts. It then set the ball rolling where somebody could say, this is the Textus Receptus without any errors, without any corruption, without any changes. And that lays a foundation in which a theologically driven fundamentalism can begin to grow. And that leads to the crisis in some circles of the conservative church today. It wasn't there over 500 years ago. Helpful examples may be found in the biographies and histories of the contemporaries, Plutarch, Suetonius, and Tacitus, who give us accounts of various events and major figures such as Roman emperors. So in other words, this isn't just something we observe in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. You can see it in literature that's roughly contemporaneous with the Gospels. You have first-rate Greco-Roman historians such as Plutarch, who writes in Greek, and Suetonius and Tacitus, who write in Latin, and they're talking about relatively recent events, emperors who ruled just a generation before, and they have access to multiple sources, and they do exactly the same thing we see in the Gospels. A good friend of mine, Craig Keener, has recently compared the various accounts of the life and death of Otho, a relatively unimportant emperor. He didn't rule very long. It was during that chaotic period after Nero committed suicide in 68. Anyway, he was emperor from January 15th to April 16th. That's all in the year 69. The three historians wrote 40 to 50 years after the death of Otho. Thus, the temporal distance between them and their subject is about the same as the temporal distance between the New Testament evangelists, or at least their finished products that are in our New Testament that we call Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and their subject, which is Jesus of Nazareth. The three Roman historians drew on some common material, just as the New Testament evangelists did. The principal elements in the story of Otho, as told by the three Roman historians, number about 70. 70 elements in his life leading up to, and then especially including his few months as emperor. No one version of the man's life contains all 70 of these elements, and no one gospel contains everything about Jesus. But most of them are found in Plutarch and Tacitus. Several are missing in Suetonius, for his is a much shorter account. So see, a lot of stuff is missing in Mark, or what we call Q. In fact, Suetonius' compression of the story sometimes creates confusion. Had it not been for the fuller accounts of Plutarch and Tacitus, historians would often not be in a position to resolve the problem. And by the way, that actually happens occasionally when Matthew and Matthew and Luke find Mark's account, individual stories, a bit wordy. Mark does have a tendency to be wordy, and since they're writing, Matthew and Luke are writing longer accounts, they find it necessary often, almost always, to compress Mark. And sometimes in compressing Mark, details are left out that you wouldn't quite fully understand the story in Matthew or Luke if you didn't have Mark at your fingertips to look at and say, oh, I see why he said that. Because the missing detail is in Mark, and then that explains what's happening better in the story. Not surprisingly, there are a number of discrepancies in the accounts of Plutarch, Tacitus, and Suetonius in their history of Otho. Suetonius and Tacitus give Otho's astrologer different names. It was suspected that the discrepancy is due to confusing the name of Otho's astrologer with the name of Vespasian's astrologer. Vespasian, of course, becomes emperor a year and a half later. Tacitus says Densus defended Galba. Plutarch says Densus defended Galba's adopted son Piso. Tacitus says Otho left the city of Rome in the care of his brother Titianus, but elsewhere Tacitus says Titianus had left Rome. Suetonius says Rome was under the authority of Sabinus. A number of other discrepancies, including chronological discrepancies, could be cited. The function of rhetoric, that is an argument that's being made or an apologia that's being made, including the practices associated with crai that I've talked about briefly, can be detected throughout the accounts of the three Roman historians, especially as they relate to Otho's speeches. We observe expansion, condensation, omission, and rearrangement. Plutarch, Suetonius, and Tacitus have different purposes, and they write from different perspectives. At times, bias is evident. Discrepancies notwithstanding, the points of agreement in the accounts of Plutarch, Suetonius, and Tacitus are far more numerous. A coherent and plausible portrait of the life, brief reign, and death of Otho emerges. No historian despairs over the discrepancies and indications of authorial bias and declares, in the light of such bias and discrepancies, that we cannot know what Otho did and what happened to him. Indeed, modern historians have high regard for these three historians of late antiquity. The same applies to the New Testament Gospels. The stories and teachings of Jesus have been edited and contextualized in ways that lead to clarity. The teaching of Jesus has been applied in new ways, and new insights have been discovered as his followers encounter fresh challenges. All of this reflects the way Jesus taught his disciples. It reflects the pedagogy of his time. The disciples were not tape recorders, mere reciters of the Jesus tradition. They were disciples. They were learners, trained to understand the teaching of Jesus, not simply to repeat it word for word. They were trained to apply it as they gave leadership to the following of Jesus, a following that in time became known as the church. It is to this training, this ability to apply Jesus' teaching in new and creative ways, that the saying in Matthew 13 alludes. Jesus says to his disciples, every scribe who has been discipled. The Greek word is mathetes, that is, has been mathetes, has been discipled, has been trained, has been educated. For the kingdom of heaven is like a householder who brings out of his treasure what is new, as well as what is old. That's Matthew 13, verse 52. Jesus did not say, every scribe who has been discipled for the kingdom of heaven must repeat my words verbatim. That's not what he said. In reference to this verse, Dale Allison and W.D. Davies, in their magisterial commentary on the Gospel of Matthew, rightly comment that, quote, the ability to teach new and old rests upon the ability to understand Jesus' teaching, not just to memorize it and recite it, but to understand it precisely. Summing up, I believe that most Christians do not understand the genre and nature of biblical literature. When it comes to writings that are ostensibly historical, broadly speaking, there is a tendency to impose upon them a modern understanding of what constitutes proper history. When someone is quoted, we expect the quotation to be verbatim and to be set off with quotation marks. We expect strict chronology and sequence. If sources are cited, we expect footnotes. If the Gospels or other writings from late antiquity appear to violate these modern canons, we speak of contradictions, mistakes, and errors. I'll read a little bit of the footnote that goes with that statement. And I'm again thinking of Bart Ehrman, his misquoting Jesus, which got it all started in the fall of 2005. Also, the already cited Jesus Interrupted in 2009 for a critique of this aspect of Ehrman's understanding of Scripture, where he says, Matthew reads this way, Luke reads this way. They can't both be true, so it must be a mistake. Dale Martin, a longtime friend, indeed was actually tutored by Bart Ehrman years ago in Greek. Dale Martin, who teaches New Testament at Yale Divinity School, he says this about Ehrman. Quote, Ehrman allowed textual criticism to destroy his faith in Scripture because he had an inadequate theology of Scripture. That's correct. And nobody can accuse Dale Martin of being a fundamentalist. He's about as far left as you can go and still be on the planet Earth. Another good book on this topic, I'm still picking some things out of this lengthy footnote. Christian Smith's book, The Bible Made Impossible, Why Biblicism is Not a Truly Evangelical Reading of Scripture. Let me say that again. The subtitle of his book. This came out as Baker, by the way, Brazos Press, an imprint of Baker Academic. They published the book. So this is not some wild, crazy, left-wing Harvard University Press book. The subtitle of Smith's book, Why Biblicism, and that's a word that he doesn't coin, others use it too. or what I'm calling textual fundamentalism, why biblicism is not a truly evangelical reading of Scripture. Smith is on the faculty of Notre Dame. He describes this game as the exercise, and he's critiquing Bart Ehrman and others like him, of finding long lists of Scripture texts that appear to contradict each other, to which some sophomoric skeptics devote themselves in order to try to undermine the Bible's coherence and authority. That merely mirrors the worst kind of fundamentalist literalism to which few thoughtful evangelicals subscribe, and betrays a pitiable misunderstanding of how human language works. That's an interesting statement. And if you want these long lists of supposed devastating contradictions, just surf the net, you'll find them. Blogs that do that. Smith calls this fundamentalist approach to Scripture biblicism. He warns that the biblicist approach often leads to unnecessary crises in faith. The faith of Christian youth who have been taught scriptural fundamentalism, now quoting Smith again, can later founder and sometimes collapse when antagonistic non-biblicists point out and press home real problems with biblicist theory. That's on page 88, and he goes on to talk about Bart Ehrman himself, and whom he knows personally. The Gospels reflect a world quite different from our own. Proper historiography in late antiquity allowed for and sometimes required editing and paraphrasing, always for the sake of clarification. And by the way, every Sunday, I would wager 99% of the preachers in Houston do this too, whether they acknowledge it or not. And they do it when they're in the pulpit and they say, now what Adam really said was, they're doing it. Now, when Paul says this, what he really means is, that's exactly, and they're doing the right thing. That's a pedagogy that Jesus enjoined upon his own disciples. They're doing the very thing that we're talking about. They are paraphrasing, they're editing, they're expanding. Usually it's expansion. So a 2-verse passage becomes a 30-minute sermon. They're expanding on the text to make it clear to people who live in 21st century South Texas and happen not to live in 1st century Asia Minor or 1st century Galilee. We see this in the Gospels. We find in the New Testament Gospels a plausible portrait of the historical Jesus, a portrait that is true to what we know of the time in which Jesus and his disciples lived. Major New Testament scholars who do not identify themselves as conservative Christians, and I can cite several like the late Ben Meyer, E.P. Sanders, who is retired now, the still active Roman Catholic scholar John Meyer, among others, they believe that the Gospels are more than adequate as sources from which we may construct a portrait of the historical Jesus. In the introduction to his critically acclaimed Jesus and Judaism, 1985, Ed Sanders remarks, quote, "The dominant view today seems to be that we can know pretty well what Jesus was out to accomplish, that we can know a lot about what he said, and that those two things make sense within the world of 1st century Judaism." This was true when first published in 1985, is just as true today. And finally, let us recall what Jude says in the New Testament, verse 3. "Beloved, when I gave all diligence to write to you of the common salvation, it was needful for me to write to you and exhort you that we should earnestly contend for the faith which was once delivered to the saints." Note that Jude did not say the text that was once delivered to the saints. It was the faith that was delivered, and our text, with all its variations, I think, is a reliable witness to that faith. Thank you.
We'll have time for questions, so got a mic that will be coming around, so if you have questions to ask,
Dr. Evans, thank you for that. I just had a brief, maybe you could address this. You noted a severe lacking of ability in sort of some of the modern critics of the text. It seems like they're missing like huge gaps of knowledge of antiquity or rhetoric or things like that. What would you suggest that, let's say people do, let's say they're planning on going to seminary, they're learning biblical languages. What else should they be studying so that they're not falling off the boat?
Yeah, very good question. Thank you for asking that. It's not easy. I wish I could say there's a handy dandy guide. It takes 2 hours to read it. You'll know everything you need to know. But there isn't. There isn't. And you know, that's bad news. The good news is the material, I think, sufficient material is available. And it is accessible. And we who speak English are very blessed because just about everything is available in English translation. What are some of the things that are necessary to know? Well, obviously, in this particular case, you need to read widely. You need to know something about how sacred texts were interpreted 2,000 years ago. The pedagogy, the hermeneutics, the exegesis. You need to know about historiography. I think the first step is to become aware of how, unless we're told otherwise, we assume it's a default. Jimmy Dunn calls it the default. The way we understand things. We're not even conscious of that. The way we understand proper history, what it should be, how we understand anything, our worldview, it just unconsciously we carry it with us everywhere we go. And so when we're looking at old texts or we're in a modern but different culture today, you know, if you haven't traveled much, you know, Americans are great for that. The United States is a huge country. You got 300 million people speaking the same language, more or less. And then you travel and you go somewhere else and you think, boy, people are strange here. They look different, they eat different, and they talk funny. And I mean, this is the problem we as human beings have. We live in our own little world, and so we need to become aware of that. That's the big principle. But I think that said, you need to read widely in the field. I advocate that. I've been advocating that for a long time. And I'm glad to see that in evangelical circles, there's a greater receptivity to the idea of knowing what the Apocrypha says. The Apocryphal books, the pseudepigraphal books, the Dead Sea Scrolls, Josephus, Philo, right, and a lot of classical texts. We have a strong classical program here that excites me. We got some good people that understand that. So that's rabbinics, the early rabbis, the Targums, the Aramaic paraphrases. All of these things are important, and that's what starts expanding your brain, and you begin to recognize, oh, I see, they thought differently. They just did things differently. You don't want to read the Gospels, you don't want to look at Jesus as though he's a 21st century North American. See, and that's what happens. And so when he's teaching, he does it the way we do it, you know, and to the point of naively understanding the Gospels in that word-to-word sense as though it's been videotaped. And if that's your default position, then you have problems when a demagogue like Bart Ehrman stands up and says, but Matthew says this, and Luke reads differently. They can't both be true. You want to know what the answer is to that? Well, actually, yes, they are. Matthew is very true for his context. Luke is very true for the audience that he's saying. And if Jesus would slap them both on the back and say, way to go. You are, scribes, trained for the kingdom of heaven. You are bringing out of my thesaurus, my treasure box, new stuff and not just old. But see, Bart is trapped. He's been, you know, I know I'm speaking behind his back, but I'd say it if he was here. He's trapped, I think, in a fundamentalist paradigm. The textual fundamentalism is still there. Publicly in a debate with him during the Q&A, somebody asked, well, what would it take, Professor Ehrman, for you to be satisfied that the text is reliable? This was a text critical question. He said, all I'm saying is if you can't show every single word to be original, how do you know you have anything? I about fell off my stool. That's textual fundamentalism. That's how textual fundamentalism thinks. And yet, just 2 minutes before, he said, I'm not a fundamentalist. Yes, thanks for that question. Someone else. I might say Katya Kovret is over here, or was over here. Katya, yeah, there you are. She represents Zondervan, and part of the agenda for her visit here, she's speaking to various faculty and so on about potential publishing projects, but I'm the editor of a series that's being planned that Zondervan will bring out, several volumes, that will actually deal with the various texts I just mentioned. So Josephus and Philo and the pseudepigrapha and so on, and the whole point of it is to show how it's relevant for understanding the New Testament, the kind of stuff you need to know so you can deal with these questions. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Evans, for a wonderful presentation. I teach New Testament, and I'm also a pastor, so I teach students that are lay people, and it's always a shock when they discover the ipsum verba is not what we have. So I appreciated that. My question is related to Q, because you got me interested in that, and I wrote it down so it would make sense. Wouldn't the existence of written crya and later, or memorized crya, I should say, and later scribal harmonizations potentially make unnecessary a theory of written Q documents? So in other words, if the craya existed, they memorized them in that sense, and then later scribal harmonizations created the verbal similarities that we see within the Synoptic Gospels, wouldn't that potentially make unnecessary any theory of written Q document?
Yeah, I think so, because do we have Q today? So I think you're right. I think that's why we don't have a Q document floating around that somebody in the late first century decided that, notwithstanding its heavy use in Matthew and Luke, let's write it down anyway. I mean, we're fortunate we didn't lose Mark. And I think the Petrine connection, the connection to Peter, kept Mark for us. It's a real interesting discussion there. Mark might have originally circulated basically as just a resource. Here's the Jesus teaching and activities and stories, particularly as they were related by Peter and they circulated. That's one theory. And then only after the idea of, hey, these Gospels are pieces of literature, somebody buffed up Mark and it survived. But I think what happened for Q, how much of it was written, and there are statistical studies that suggest, in fact, a lot of it was written when it was utilized by Matthew and Luke. But whatever, however it's circulated, written, verbal, both, its heavy use, it's being soaked up almost entirely in Matthew and Luke, and then some overlap with Mark, probably left people not to see it as something that should be preserved. I mean, we've lost a lot of things. Papias gives us 5 volumes where he quotes and discusses the sayings of the Lord. I mean, what a treasure. I would nominate Dan Wallace for a Nobel Peace Prize if he finds Papias's lost work in a monastery in Eastern Europe or Greece someday. That would be spectacular. By the way, mentioning Papias actually refers to Peter's teaching. Peter's teaching of what Jesus taught, he uses the word kreia. So when we relate this to the Gospels, we're relating it not simply because we see the similarities, but that's what Papias calls it. Anyone else?
Thank you, Dr. Evans, for an excellent presentation. Much to think about. Two-part question. You stressed that with the printing revolution, there was a change of concern for precision in the text and so forth. How would you respond to the fact that maybe earlier there were, or very early on, efforts to harmonize, Tatian's Diatessaron, and then later in church history, Augustine's Harmony of the Gospels, or even Calvin, when he did his commentaries, his commentaries on the Pentateuch were a harmonization, and also on the Gospels, the Synoptic Gospels. So that's the first part. Wasn't there a harmonization tendency very early on? And then secondly, relatedly, on one hand, I heard you say that in ancient times they would have been much more comfortable with kind of lack of precision, so we could have 3 synoptic gospels in the canon, and people would be comfortable with perceived differences, lack of agreement in ipsissima verbis, so forth. But on the other hand, I heard you say that with modern text criticism, there was the discovery of efforts in the tradition to harmonize these things. Isn't that contradictory to some degree?
I don't think that's quite how I said it. And one thing, I would never say that there was no concern with precision. That's a different thing. There was great interest in accuracy and so on, but what constituted accuracy and precision might not always be the same thing. For us, it's a word-to-word thing. That was less of the focus. So there are many facets to your question. I might have to ask you to remind me of parts that I overlooked. But yes, there was a lot of harmonizing that went on in the 2nd century. We know of Tatian's diatessaron, diatessaron. It just basically means through the 4, you end up with the one gospel. Probably his mentor, Justin Martyr, had done something like that, we think, with respect to Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and then Tatian, a decade or 2 later, expands that to include John. Augustine does the same thing, though Augustine did not know Greek hardly at all and did not know Hebrew, and he creates what did he call it? Evangelistarum? Is that anyway? I can't remember the name he gives it. And where these have a pedagogical purpose. John Calvin does the same thing at 1555 or something like that, and it's convenient. I mean, that's really what a scholar does too today when he talks about the historical Jesus. You know, you write a book on Jesus, 500 pages long, you're harmonizing material, you're bringing parallel passages together. So it's the purpose of it that's behind it. The 2nd century harmonizing, I think, was largely motivated to answer skeptics who were looking for anything that they could complain about. And so they did zero in on some differences, I think, in a very inconsistent, even hypocritical way, and said, look at that. I mean, they were being Bart Ehrmans in the 2nd century. These contradict each other. You know, how many women were at the tomb Sunday morning? You know, that kind of thing. And so some of the harmonizing was apologetically motivated, just as it is in modern times. Like, have you ever heard of Life of Christ in stereo? The whole point of it is to try to remove all the discrepancies. The editors of that work, it's 1969, I think, no understanding of what I've been talking about. So they clearly understand the Gospels. The Gospels ought to reflect modern historiography, but there's a problem, so they harmonize in fantastic ways. So Peter denies Jesus in 2 sets of 3. Jesus cleanses the temple at least twice. You just start multiplying things, and there's no allowance for the editing and recontextualization that was part of the pedagogy and historiography in the past. So that's part of the problem too. My only point about in the medieval period prior to the printing press, nobody was bothered by variations in wording because it was always there. Anybody who saw 2 or more manuscripts, and by the way, 2 or more manuscripts, what I mean is 2 copies of Matthew wouldn't be identical. 2 copies of Luke wouldn't be identical. Now the differences are quite minor, but the idea of seeing a different word, and then of course they're handwritten, so you might be looking at a page and then you have, of course, notes in the margins. Are these just different readings? And sometimes we don't know. We usually assume they're corrections or something like that. And so they're used to that. It's not a big shock. The printing press changes that, and now you have a stabilization. This is the way it always reads in Matthew. And then when you add to that, a couple centuries later, 2-3 centuries later, the discovery or rediscovery of very old manuscripts, going back to the 4th century, like Vaticanus and Sinaiticus, now you get gospel texts that have not been harmonized very much by the scribes themselves down through on into the Middle Ages. Harmonizations that are not apologetically motivated, not out of panic, but just sleepy scribes writing more familiar with the way Matthew says it, and so when he's writing the parallel passage in Luke, it just ends up sounding like Matthew. Those kinds of harmonizations. Well, text criticism of Erasmus and his successors then see exposed a lot of that. So now we have a rawer text that's closer, probably a 2nd century text, and we see these kinds of bumps and differences, and which is good. It actually helps the exegetical task. So anyway, that may be a lot to digest, and this is my first draft. I think I want to read it again and again for clarity and logic and coherence, make sure it's what I'm talking about makes sense and why I'm covering it this way. But thanks for your question.